curiously, as I described in my latest book, it has not been just a matter recently of industrial policy, but about handpicking specific companies, giving them these sweetheart tax deals. One big example is, for instance, the Apple deal in Ireland. This has been done for the sake of creating employment, beggar your neighbor policy, competition policies. So this is not a particularly left idea, but during the pandemic, with this massive state intervention in the economy, indeed, even right-wing government seems to be going left. And I have one thing to say to that. This is the wrong left. So not this left, the other left we need. We have been set off in that wrong direction already before the pandemic. Over the past decade, even left-wing pundits have been framing the troubles of our societies in the language of inequality. Fighting inequality has become celebrity politics, not only on the left, with authors such as Thomas Piketty and Joseph Stiglitz. Christine Lagarde, back when she was chair of the IMF, has been urging governments to fight inequality because inequality is bad for growth. So we impoverish the masses, they cannot consume, capitalism is in trouble. Now, even conservative-led governments issue huge payments to shore up some workers' income-depleted bank accounts. Shall we celebrate that? But so as I note in my book, our fixation on inequality is appealing to our sense of injustice, of course, but it is unfortunately obscuring two greater troubles: poverty and massive precarity. By the way, we might do well to remember that equality does not figure prominently in communist literature even. So our current obsession is rather curious. The formula of wealth allocation for Marx is to each according to their needs. This is not economic equality. Note also that if we value equality, if thinking of justice in terms of equality implies a logic of comparison between individuals and groups and presents the idea of social justice in individualistic terms. When we struggle for equality, we in fact remain captive of the neoliberal policy logic according to which individuals and groups are responsible for their well-being. This is not socialist. It is the notion of collective well-being, which has always been fundamental for socialism, not economic equality. These are very different things if you come to think of it. So the pandemic has revealed in a very clear ways that our societies are privately rich, but publicly poor. The economist John Kenneth Galbraith sounded that alarm already back in 1958 with his book, The Affluent Society. What has happened in the past 4 decades is this condition has been aggravated by new factors that he could not have studied back in the 50s. So let's take these 4 decades of structural adjustment policies, what they did to our societies. They weakened our societies in 2 ways: by reducing job security and by slashing public spending on essential services. And I'm stressing those 2 things because this is where we need to focus our attention in the future. So job security and building public services, including healthcare. These policies were launched in the late 20th century, allegedly for the sake of ensuring national competitiveness in the global market. So we need to fight that too, that prioritization of national competitiveness in the global market. After the financial meltdown of 2008, these same structural adjustment policies were further deepened for the sake of financial stabilization. So as a result of this, contemporary capitalism, and this is the main message of my book, contemporary capitalism has created not just a precarious class what the economist Guy Standing has called the precariat, but a precarious multitude. The pathology of precarity, of economic and social insecurity, afflicts almost everybody. This is the disease of the 99%, irrespectively of educational or professional background and economic levels. So this social precarity is severely stratified. There's rampant inequalities within that. Of course, we need to fight this, but we need to remember that above all, we need to fight the underlying condition of precarity. And we will not be able to remedy that with redistribution, nor with worker involvement in company boards, not even giving workers shares in these private companies as it has become fashionable to advise. That's one of Piketty's advices, for instance. This kind of policy might diminish the inequality within an otherwise rotten system without changing the system at all. So a privately wealthy society, let me repeat that, even if not too unequal, can still be precarious if essential public services are missing or deficient of funds. This is what the pandemic has made it very, very clear. Now, another trap, I don't know if I can still, do I have a couple of still minutes? Another trap to avoid, so I'm trying to do some myth busting here. So the first myth to bust is the fixation on inequality. The other is the return to the mantra of growth and redistribution. It's a bad idea because although we are tending to go back, this is the easiest formula to embrace, to push for, but it will undermine the green agenda. We need to place at the heart of our social justice agenda not the ideas of shared affluence, as even the radical left is promising shared affluence. We need to stop with that. But the goal of fighting precarity, only in this way we can reconcile the social justice agenda with the green justice agenda of social stability and environmental security. So anti-precarity politics can be achieved by what I call building the political economy of trust. So which makes us focus on the satisfaction of human needs by building up, by providing employment stability and building up the public services rather than promising this shared affluence. Let me stop here.
Excellent, Albena. That was really interesting. Thank you so much for that. I think I certainly found that very, very thought-provoking, and I'm sure it won't end there. I'm not going to try to reflect on everybody as they come up, otherwise it will be the chair talking too much. So our next speaker is going to be Janine. Janine, take it away. Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me and giving me 10 minutes to sound off. I'm going to be talking mainly about transport. One of the reasons for that is being on a panel is a very good way of ensuring that you don't cover the same ground as anyone else, because no one else ever talks about transport. Transport is not one of the left's sexy issues. We don't go on many demos about transport, and you'd actually be pushed to know what the left's policy is on transport, other than it should be publicly owned and it should probably be a bit better than it is. And I think we need to do better than that to find out. Although having said that, the coronavirus pandemic is probably not the most opportune time to be promoting public transport, because we're all under advice to not travel on it, so as to not spread the virus. However, it should be pointed out that in the interest of rationality, that at any other time other than a global pandemic, public transport is infinitely superior to private transport on many levels. So it's far, far safer. Measure that in deaths per passenger mile, if you like. It's negligible on public transport compared to in cars, lorries, etc. It is healthier. Societies which have better public transport have better health outcomes. It is better for the environment. It's a better, more efficient use of land. It takes up much less land to run public transport than it does private transport. So I've worked on London Underground for 23 years, and I've studied and learned a bit about it in that time. And I did write a book. There you go. I might promote it in the chat in a bit. And as part of my study of the history and governance of London Underground, I came to the conclusion that London Underground's well-being, in terms of how good a service it is, depends on 5 factors. Okay, one is its ownership. Is it owned publicly or is it owned privately? 2 is its degree of integration. Is it an integrated whole, or is it broken up by contracting out and separated management, etc.? How well is it funded? Surprisingly enough, the better it's funded, the better service it provides. 4 is its governance, whether its governance is national or local. It does better when it's run by a London body than when it's run by national government, particularly by an elected London body. And 5thly is its ethos. Is it allowed to run as a public service, as part of our social infrastructure, or is it compelled to operate as a business balancing the books? And reaching those conclusions then leads us on to think, to discuss what you might call beyond nationalisation, because the left does tend to say its answer to ownership of things is nationalise it, and there are various reasons why we've got to say more than that, or in some cases not say it at all. So the first thing I want to do is I do have something of a reputation for pedantry about words, and I'm going to be pedantic here, but it's really, really important, right? Nationalisation and public ownership are not the same thing. Nationalisation means public ownership by the national government, right? So I wouldn't want London Underground to be nationalised. Don't want it owned and run by a national government. It does a lot better when it's publicly owned by a London government. This is particularly pertinent now in the COVID crisis, when we're talking about care homes, and we're seeing terrible death rates in care homes, which is against a background of decades of care homes being underfunded, contracted out to private companies who run them as cheaply as possible, pay their workers as little as possible, you know, scrimp and save as much as possible in looking after their residents just so they can make a profit. And people want to say, absolutely rightly, bring social care back into public ownership, okay? But please don't say nationalise public social care, because nationalise it means put the national government in charge of it, and therefore you'd be saying that you are against returning it to local authority ownership and control, where I think it would be much better off. So that's a pedantic point about nationalism. If you mean public nationalisation, not nationalism, Freudian slip. If you mean public ownership, say public ownership. Only say nationalisation if you actually mean ownership by the national government. But there's more to beyond nationalisation than that, I think. Particularly because just because something is publicly owned, it doesn't necessarily mean it's good. You have to be of a certain age to remember British Rail, and you might remember it fondly if you're wearing your rose-tinted spectacles, or if you're comparing it with the privatised railway now, but you won't remember thinking very fondly of it at the time. It was rubbish, unreliable, the food was terrible, rampant low pay amongst the workforce. It is not a model of a socialist public transport system. So we need to go beyond this notion of a bureaucratic nationalisation and talk about public ownership under democratic control. It's not good enough to just have public ownership, also needs to be under public control and planned and run in the public common interest, not left to function as a business. And actually, because transport is part of our social infrastructure, planning transport means we can also reshape a lot of other aspects of our lives. We can replan city centres. We can reorganise where people work in relation to where they live, etc. So, in a quick flick back to the 1930s, in the 1930s, London Transport was brought into public ownership on the basis of a plan drafted by Herbert Morrison, the literal and political grandfather of Peter Mandelson, and he did it in what Ernest Bevin, who himself was pretty right-wing and bureaucratic and dreadful, described as positively the worst form of public ownership, because he brought it into public ownership and put it under the control of a London Passenger Transport Board, which consisted mainly of the previous private owners. So it was very much not the sort of thing that I would think we would want to see. What then happened was London transport was rubbish and there was near riots on the streets of London. And only at that point was investment made and were the services improved. So there have been some schemes floated down the years about democratic management of public transport, like, you know, some nominees from the mayor and some workers' representatives and stuff like that. But I do think it's important to draw a distinction between workers' control of industry and having some workers on the board. Because if you have a board, even if it's, I mean, an elected board would be better than the appointed boards we have now. But if it's just an elected board sitting on top of a bureaucratic management structure of the railway service or the transport service, then it's not going to give us what we want. So, in fact, the transport workers' rank and file movements of the 1970s, one of their key demands was no union reps on the London Transport Board, because they didn't want to see union reps co-opted into being bosses, essentially. So rather than having an elected board sit on top of a bureaucratic system, what we need is much more thoroughgoing democracy in the running of public transport. And one thing we can, I mean, pretty much every day at work, something happens and someone slags off something management have done and says, well, obviously, you know, we could run it better. It's like an instinctive thing that people know, that workers know better how to run the system. So I think what we need in public transport is we need to pose it not just in terms of nationalise the railways, although we should nationalise the railways, but in terms of a workers and passengers plan. So that public transport, the railway, including the railway industry, should be run by a democratically drafted and agreed workers and passengers plan. What one I would anticipate that would do is improve the accessibility of the railway service, particularly in relation to fares, but also accessibility to disabled people. Also accessibility to rural areas, extending the service into new areas, undoing cuts from the past, making a service that's more reliable, using new technology to improve the service and to work with staff rather than doing what public transport does at the moment, which is prioritise the use of new technology to extract money from your pocket rather than to operate the system. So just to finish up in my remaining 1 minute, just to go back to COVID, to the COVID crisis, okay? One thing that's noticeable, isn't it, is that the capitalist ideologues have gone quiet. We've not heard a lot of Adam Smith and Milton Friedman being quoted lately. No one's saying leave it to the market and the market will sort out COVID. And in one sense, that's an opportunity. I don't hate to sound, that sounds a bit sick, but it's an opportunity because capitalism is exposing how inadequate it is in dealing with crises. But if we're really going to expose that, then we have to explain more clearly what our socialist alternative is. And a socialist alternative is not the government owns stuff and spends a lot of money. That's not what socialism is. Socialism is measured not by how much government spend, but by how much control workers have. Public services run on socialist lines means them being run democratically by workers and users, because socialism is not the same as state ownership if the state doesn't collectively belong to the working class.
Fantastic, thank you, Janine. That was a really good note to end on. We've had a fantastic discussion so far, and we're only barely scratching the surface. We've got crept over 100 people on the session now, with more still coming in. So for those of you who've joined, thanks for joining this session, co-hosted by Another Europe is Possible and European Alternatives on COVID-19. Democratic ownership and the future of the economy. We've heard from Albena, who has given us a fantastic and really thought-provoking talk, including a point about whether or not we should focus on inequality, which has, I have to say, provoked some debate, which we will draw out during the next session. And Janine, who has talked to us as a frontline transport worker about the about whether or not public ownership is the same as nationalisation, and whether or not nationalisation and public ownership are the same thing as socialism, and how we should interact with those concepts. Both have spoken about the concept of having workers on boards in a relatively critical way. So without further ado, I'll move on to our new two next speakers, and then we'll open it to the floor. So Arielle Bennett is up next. Arielle, go ahead.
Hey, thanks very much for having me. So I'm going to talk a bit about the pharmaceutical industry and perhaps some broader challenges with the global public health, and particularly put it into context in light of the global public health emergency that we're all experiencing at the moment with COVID-19. So just a quick overview first up. How does drug development and approval work? To get a therapy approved, you do have to go through a rigorous process of several experiments, which are called clinical trials. These start off in animals, then they move into humans. There's normally several stages to them, and then you submit everything, and the regulators decide whether or not to approve it. This process can take a very long time. So from a candidate molecule to a marketed therapy can take up to 10 years, possibly longer, if you need to keep doing some more clinical trials. And the process is risky as well. So 80% of the therapies that enter into human trials are actually never approved. And in some areas, that statistic is even lower. In cancer, for example, about 8% of the drugs that enter clinical trials are successful in receiving approval. This process is actually largely driven forward by private pharma and biotech companies that are run for profit. The state and not-for-profit interventions tend to be limited to funding early stage research or supporting academics to do what they call translate their research outside into spin-off companies. And essentially what that means is the pharma companies have offloaded as much of the risk for this process as possible, because even if they get it into clinical trials, it's still a very risky process for them. So that's the current model. It is a humongous business across the globe, but it's broken. And there's three main reasons I think that this current model is broken. Firstly, it's a profit-driven model of public health. And this places real barriers to people getting the care and the treatment that they need. Probably the biggest and best example of this is drug pricing in the US, where people can literally die because they can't afford treatments such as insulin. Outside of the US, in other developing countries, pricing also significantly impacts the distribution of drugs and vaccines. But I should give a shout out to the NHS here. Thanks to its collective bargaining approach to drug price negotiation, we get a much better deal than elsewhere in the globe for drugs. And it's not uncommon for the NHS to actually reject drugs when they're first put to the NHS for approval because they don't feel they're cost effective enough. And that is because the NHS effectively negotiates, it acts as collective bargaining, and it effectively negotiates the drug prices for the entirety of the UK. Now, this is also under threat in the future when we start talking about trade deals with the US and trying to negotiate agreements with the EU and other areas of the globe. Drug companies are really, really keen to get their hands on all of the patients that are available in the UK without the gatekeeping and the pushback that they receive from the NHS at the moment. Second thing that's a big issue is that taxpayer-funded research is ultimately funneled into the venture capital system. So early stage pharma companies and biotechs are typically funded by venture capitalists. They put a lot of money in. They have very specific ideas about what they want to see from companies. They're run in very specific ways. And what that means is that when research is translated out into a biotech spin out or a startup, or it's licensed to a pharma company, the taxpayer actually sees very little return on that unless something is carefully negotiated in for a return of the profits of a successful therapy. And we can go into specifics about that later, because there's lots of different examples of that. But it's essentially a drain on taxpayer research. And again, in countries like the US, you may be funding research that you can never benefit from because you cannot afford the drugs that your tax paid for. The third major issue, then, I think the one that's most relevant to the current COVID crisis, is that the current setup of pharmaceuticals actually doesn't drive research into the areas that are most important for public health and global health. It drives research into areas that companies and investors believe are the most profitable. So those that manage chronic conditions or highly prevalent diseases such as cancer. There's an entire market around drugs to treat side effects of the growing obesity crisis, or in the US to manage conditions brought on by opioid addiction. And this is why there's almost no companies that are still researching antibiotics, despite the spread of drug-resistant bacteria. But we have over 40 drugs to manage rheumatoid arthritis, which is a chronic condition and that people need to take every day for the rest of their lives. We do have companies that already have to essentially be bribed with faster market access and patient and special patent protections in order to develop therapies for rare or unprofitable diseases. So this is obviously not acting for the benefit of the global public health system. So just to give you a brief overview of what's going on with COVID-19 specifically, I have to say that companies were actually initially reluctant to join in COVID-19 efforts. They did move quite quickly when they realized it was going to be a global pandemic, but they'd been burned before by the Ebola crisis in 2014 and the Zika epidemic in 2016 that generated a lot of coverage and a lot of initial funding, and then the perceived market for the interventions disappeared. So the companies were left shouldering a lot of the cost, and they weren't really that keen on getting involved in COVID until it was clear it was going to be a global issue. And that's why we have seen a lot of state intervention, a lot of state funding of private companies to support that research. And it's also why we've seen a lot of collaborations between pharma companies on the research, because they don't want to take on that risk as an individual company, because it's a lot to put in. I'm actually not going to go into specifics about the therapies that are under investigation at the moment, but we can talk about them if you would like to in the discussion. But I did want to talk a bit more about vaccines. I have to say a lot of the timelines are wildly ambitious. We're not going to see a widespread, highly effective, safe vaccine that's available this year. But I really wanted to highlight that there are major issues brewing at the moment in terms of international diplomacy around which countries will be able to access which vaccines first. And this is actually largely being decided on the basis of how much money countries are willing to input into companies. So for example, Sanofi, which is a French company, is based in France, has a lot of operations there, is doing research in France on vaccines, has already come out and said that because the US has given it the most money to develop a vaccine, that it will have the first access to that vaccine, despite the fact that it's being researched and developed in France. The US is also in trouble in Germany for attempting to bribe a German company to gain access to the vaccine first. And I can really see as these types of things progress, this is going to start causing major diplomatic issues. And it's also a real cause for concern with developing countries as well, because they're not able to essentially pay for access to those therapies. And it really shows how fragmented the landscape is for vaccine development. You know, what we really should be seeing is an internationally coordinated effort, but the WHO has actually really struggled to get any funding from countries or companies into an international effort to tackle the pandemic and to tackle it in developing countries specifically. Countries have been slowly paying into it, but it's been really slow to get off the ground. So what could some alternatives look like in terms of setups that move away from a profit model and towards a more democratic and internationally focused model of public health? Well, for starters, I think we do need internationally funded organizations that are actually properly resourced to tackle blue sky. I say that because that's normally how people describe unprofitable issues, global public health issues, rather than following the free market, which leads them into treating conditions that perhaps already are well served. So something along the lines of Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation actually goes some way towards this model, but I'd like to see that out of the hands of billionaires and not reliant on their whims, and have it properly controlled by, say, an international consortium of experts. So for example, the WHO would be a great place to start with this, and this is something we could be pushing for, is the WHO to have extra funding and actually more political teeth, because it's currently limited in how much clout it has and how it's able to rebuke or address issues with countries that are not following its advice. So the most it's been able to do is one massive subtweet of the US and the UK for not following its advice, rather than having any recourse to, impose sanctions or tell them that they're doing it wrong, when it's clear that they are, and they have been. Finally, in the last Labour manifesto, it actually also proposed the idea of a nationalised pharma company in its manifesto. Now, this is somewhere where I do think that it makes sense to have the state controlling this kind of enterprise, because of the scale needed for it. It would make sense at a national scale or an international scale rather than a county by county or localized scale. So that might actually help to go some way to addressing problems with things that I haven't talked about, like supply of essential drugs, subverting the expectations that pharma companies can essentially brute force their way into the UK market. And it could also offer a model for developing countries as well to help support them setting up their own national pharma companies to provide access to the drugs that they need in their countries, but that they're either unable to afford because they're not able to buy them off the companies, or the companies aren't making them anymore because they're not profitable. And I'd just like to finally say that I think this pandemic has really shown that global health, countries shouldn't be left to tackle global health problems on their own. And we need an internationalist response. We need to have an internationally coordinated approach to global health, because trying to deal with it as an individual country simply isn't going to work. And this is only going to become more serious as the effects of climate change come online. And we are looking at future serious epidemics in the future as well. And so this is the start, and we need to get set up for that. Sorry to end on doom and gloom, but
that's quite all right. It's the era of a pandemic. I think we're quite used to doom and gloom. It was really, there was ever a time to understand pharma from the left. I think now is the time, and I was also really struck by how international the dynamics are. I'm sure other people will have lots of thoughts, and there'll be lots of time to discuss this already. In the meantime, I can say with some certainty that people have been discussing one subject quite a lot, and that is the quality of British rail sandwiches during the period of nationalisation in the mid-20th century. Without any further ado, I am going to introduce our final speaker, Hilary Wainwright, who is a thinker and writer on many, many things, especially on this, and is also a member of our own national committee. So Hilary, you've got 10 minutes to talk about the theme. Go ahead, take it away. You're currently on mute, by the way.
Oh, that's right. Okay. So first, I've really enjoyed the other contributions, and I hope I won't duplicate. I'll sort of build on what they've said, which have been really stimulating. And so I suppose almost starting from where we are now, and feeling this sense of ambiguity, ambivalence, that on the one hand this virus is a complete nightmare in terms of personal tragedy, sort of the frustration of isolation and so on. On the other hand, there's a sort of opportunity in it. I mean, that one's aware that that suddenly social need, i.e. public health, is the sort of, or has been until recently, until last week, the driving force of the economy and the government. And that's not because of the government's own desire. I mean, you've got to remember that at the beginning they were talking about herd immunity, and I haven't got the quote from Dominic Cummings exactly, but it was basically, let everybody get infected, that's the best way of getting immunity, and a few pensioners might suffer, kind of thing, and so what. So initially the approach was very kind of laissez-faire, if you like, in economic terms, and wasn't driven by need. And actually then it was like the public started taking action themselves. If you remember right at the beginning, the public started, in a way, the lockdown, and the government had to respond. And so we had a short period when when need was the driving force, public health was the driving force. But in that period, the consequences of privatization were dramatically and tragically revealed, so that one saw, the complete, terror really of hospitals competing, for PPE, for protective equipment that every hospital needed. And yet, because the whole trust hospital system has effectively been a kind of privatization of hospitals. You had, some hospitals had too much, some had too little. There was a complete lack of the kind of integration that Janine has talked about. So in many different ways, you saw the really damaging, socially damaging effects of privatization and of the market being allowed into this sphere of the public good. So now you've got a brief restoration of, well, not restoration, because privatization actually is continuing, and the fact that all these apps and the kind of research process is still in a way privately led is a real sort of indictment and a real problem. But you have got certain elements, as Mike and others have said, of public intervention, effectively public ownership of the wage bill, and so on. And so but you can also see, like you could see from the government's last, Boris Johnson's last intervention, that they're desperate to go back to normality, i.e. back to the market, and away from this need-driven, public health-driven sort of dynamic. And so we've got to, there's two ways in which we could go. Like there is after any crisis. There was after the Second World War. We faced this crisis. There could have been a complete dismantling of the public infrastructure, the public domination of the economy that had been a characteristic of the war. But instead, people chose to go with a Labour government. They wanted no return to the 30s and to effectively a market-driven economy. And so we got the beginnings of a public economy with the nationalizations of that period. Now, we could grasp an opportunity to go much further, as Janine says, beyond nationalization. And we could think of not only restoring public ownership of the NHS, but also how to learn from this experience to build a more democratic NHS. I mean, obviously, the NHS is something we clap and we are really, believe in. And it's in a way the one public sector that they weren't able to privatize. Well, at least until latterly, actually, until under a Labour government. But that's because there was a real belief, people in a way felt a vested interest in the NHS. There was a kind of de facto democracy, but still you can see now, the flaws of its administration, that it's dominated by accountants. The hospitals are dominated by accountants, not by doctors, not by nurses. There's not the kind of knowledge of need that exists amongst those on the front line. And until we have a democratic and public NHS, those needs, the needs of users too, of patients, won't really be the driving force. So maybe we've got to think a bit more in depth about what state intervention could be. That state intervention in itself is not necessarily progressive or democratic. That in a way, firstly, it depends on the state being democratic. I mean, the point in 45, the nationalisation wasn't really democratic. It was, a bit as Janine says, basically it was the old private companies, a few, retired generals and so on, running the coal board, the railways, and the unions were kind of effectively kept out of any real sort of involvement. I mean, there were clear gains in terms of public investment, greater coordination, greater health and safety. But often they acted increasingly as a private company, putting profits before need. And also there was no transparency. It was very secretive. There was no real accountability. but that's because it was lodged within a very undemocratic state. You know, our state has no real accountability because it's not based on a democratic constitution. It's based on a sort of monarchical, unwritten constitution. And unwritten, we know from our own organizations, and unwritten rules are always rules that the elite can manipulate. And so until we have a real democracy, you know, some kind of republic, some kind of democratic electoral system, all the requirements of a democratic system, including, above all, transparency and accountability and real freedom of information. I mean, it's shocking. Just recently, you know, I think Channel 4 revealed that whistleblowers, that doctors and nurses who've said actually the equipment isn't there or things are not working have been silenced. And actually, just one final thing on the present situation is the whole crisis with care homes. You know, there's a lot to do with the fact that care homes are not publicly run. They're not transparently run. They're not run by rules, so that the workers are not paid properly. There's no real accountability. And so the sooner that care homes become part of the health system and publicly run, the better. But I want to concentrate a bit on what a democratic state would involve, because I looked at the experience in Uruguay where the state is quite democratic. There was a strong struggle after the dictatorship for a democratic constitution. And that meant first and foremost that the state set social goals for the public industry. So they weren't just public as infrastructure for the private sector and for, you know, I mean, for better investment and so on, which is all good. I don't want to completely, you know, knock the 45 model, but it wasn't good enough. It wasn't public enough, you know, and I agree with Janine's point about the difference between public ownership and nationalization. But what gives content to that idea of public is the idea of democratically set social purposes. You know, so I mean, for example, in Uruguay, the national telecom system, you know, has a purpose to serve the public. So it provides facilities for education, for every child to have a computer, to be connected by the public broadband system, which we're beginning to realize it could have been really useful had Labour won. So firstly, you have that possibility of a democratically set goal, which is also very publicly available. And so people are brought up to know the kind of purposes of the public company, the purposes of the railways, which would include better food. I mean, I've got very strong opinions on that. And, you know, all those kinds of ideas about need would be built into the notion of democracy, because the measure of need would be, you know, drawn from a public consultation, a democratic process. So the goal would not be imitating a private company. It wouldn't be profit. It would be the maximization of public benefit as distinct from the maximization of public need. So then you must tick me off when I must stop, Mike. So then one gets on to the question of implementation, which is really the question of the internal structures of the nationalized and public companies. And there, I think there are two kinds of, well, one general point, which is, I think there, what's crucial is whose knowledge must be drawn on. And the traditional management structure of nationalized industries had a very elitist notion of knowledge. You know, a notion of knowledge being simply the knowledge of the expert as defined in terms of sort of civil servants, traditional scientists, and so on. And I think what we've learned from experience is that actually there's also kind of knowledge which is practical knowledge. Some people call it tacit knowledge, which, you know, is the knowledge that occurs in the process. I mean, if you think about nurses and doctors and also ancillary health workers. I remember when my mum was dying, it was actually the ancillary worker, I don't know what you call her, but she wasn't an official nurse, but she was the most observant of mum's condition and, you know, the most sort of wise about what could be done. But her knowledge was then combined with the knowledge of the nurse and the doctor and the consultant. And now you can see, you know, that tacit knowledge of the nurses being so important in the process. But that wouldn't, this is why I think that Janine's right about saying it can't all be resolved by workers on the board. I'm not sure it can be resolved either by a workers and users plan. I think it's also to do with the actual work processes of a public company, whether it's the tube or the railways or hospitals. That democratic process involves an ethic that involves listening to the knowledge and practical skill of everybody in the team. And there, I mean, I think we've got to think about structures and forms of organisation that are not necessarily public just in the sense of government, but can learn from and maybe sometimes be based on a cooperative model or a commons model. I think we've got to look at other experiences of social ownership, but recognise that they've got to be framed by social rules. I probably need to stop there. So I just think that we've got to now, in a way, experiment. I think that we've got to go and fight for what we've learned. I mean, take the food industry, you know, the ways in which all kinds of social mutual networks of food provision are being discovered, created. Now, couldn't we have a national food, you know, commission, a national food service that has some sort of public ownership of the food sort of supply lines and so on, but also a lot of local coordination of cooperatives and so on. Just finally, I think the other thing that's moving from the local to the international, as Arielle said, I think it was, and maybe Albena, the crucial importance of the globe. This is a global problem. Climate change is a global problem, and it's been really interesting seeing the importance of the WHO. I mean, the scandal of the US not being willing to fund it, but we've got to pay more attention to how we support the global institutions of the UN and how we connect them, how they get connected to the national and the local in new ways that recognize that it's actually democratically decided global standards and global intervention that can deal with pandemics and climate change. And in a way, we've got to see this as almost like a rehearsal for the kind of international, national and local action that we take in respect of climate change and the recurrence of pandemics. I'll stop there.
Hilary, that was a very good kind of big think overarching end to the initial bit of the session. But now we are going over to you. So there are more than 100 people, which is obviously fantastic. I've got 2 hands raised already. The way that you volunteered to speak, that's to ask a question or indeed just to make a contribution. No need to phrase it as a question if you don't want to. Is to raise your hand. And you do that by essentially taking your mouse down to near the bottom of the screen below the panelists. There should be a button there that says raise hand. If there isn't that, click on a button called participants and you should be able to raise your hand in that. But I think there are well and truly enough hands now raised. So we're going to go first to Barbara, then to Ben, then to John, and then to Richard, then to Susie, then to Caroline. We've got plenty of stuff going on from the floor. And as I've said, don't feel like because it's been said in the chat, you can't say it here. There's a lot of stuff that's going on in the written type chat that people may not have seen, but not everyone will see that. So please don't feel shy about repeating stuff that's gone on there. So Barbara Segal, over to you.
Hi, yes, I didn't expect to be first on here. Okay, it was great to hear from all the speakers. A lot of interesting stuff. I was particularly interested in a couple of the points made by Albena. But what I really wanted to say was how pleased I am to see a speaker from transport on this panel. And it does absolutely get forgotten by the left. And I don't know if that's because a lot of the coordination from the left groups happens in London, and with all the shortcomings of London transport, and I've lived in London, I can tell you, being in the provinces, we don't have anything that's a patch on what you have in London. I'm in Bristol, and we have lots of transport campaigning in Bristol. And in fact, we have had demos out in the streets, and there is quite a lot going on online at the moment. And I'm very pleased that we do have reps from both ASLEF and RMT in some of our campaigns. I'd also like to support what Janine said about the difference between top-down nationalisation and a sort of grassroots worker and user controlled public democracy at the bottom. So really, it's just a plug for public transport. Please, those of you on the left in London, don't forget that this is a huge issue. We've been talking a lot about isolation during the current crisis. And I can tell you that in rural areas, there are people that are isolated all the time who do not have cars. In some rural areas in Southwest, for example, there is no public transport at all. So yes, thanks for raising this, and keep up the good work, Janine and others.
You're on mute, Michael.
That's a terrible mistake for a chair of a Zoom meeting to make. I should know this by now. Ben Taus, you are up next, so go for it.
Hi, yeah, thanks to everyone who's contributed. It's been really interesting. I think I wanted to pick up on, well, I wanted to pick up on lots of things, but I'll just try and do one, maybe two. Is that, so Arielle talked briefly about the Labour manifesto's promise to set up a publicly owned pharmaceutical company. And I think while that was obviously better than not doing it, I think it misses something, which is that it kind of says what we'll do is we'll set up a publicly owned competitor to the private capitalist entities while leaving those intact. And while society isn't a completely zero-sum game, there are huge resources there that are currently, laboratories and factories and huge infrastructures that are necessary to both inventing, developing and producing medical treatments as well as everything else. And I think we need to talk not just about setting up a competitor and hoping that we kind of outcompete the capitalists or that we can like coexist with them, partly because as long as it's operating in a market, a public competitor will always be under pressure to behave like a business. What we need is to say that we're going to take the resources and the infrastructure currently controlled by those things, by those private companies, and put them directly, as Janine has kind of said, but transporting that over to medical care into the hands of pharmaceutical workers, scientists, health workers and patients to set the priorities. Because if you've got all of these laboratories and these huge infrastructures, rather than developing yet another copycat drug, if we put the scientists who, I don't think most people who went into science did so dreaming of making yet another copycat drug or yet another, hair loss cure, as much as I might like one. They did so because they wanted to help people. And those people working with patients are going to set an entirely different type of priority and conduct research, as Hilary said, about knowledge of work processes in an entirely different way. And if I can so I think that's also true of what the Corbyn platform said about finance. It said, let's set up a public, regional banks or whatever. But right now, the banks make huge investment decisions about where the resources of society go that direct and shape the entire economy and the entirety of society. You can set up a sort of side project to fund a small amount of wind turbines or whatever, but until you say we're going to take the banking system itself under democratic control, the existing banking system, then we're never going to get out of a loop where they continue investing in things like fossil capital and stuff like that. And I think that's only heightened by the fact that coming out of COVID, as the lockdown eases and stuff tries to go back to business, we probably, I think, will see a big credit crunch that's going to affect small businesses, working class people, ordinary people. And as long as the banking system is run according to private profit, we're going to see that. And I think we need to, we're not obviously going to win, you know, a publicly owned democratic banking system in the next 3 months, but at least we need to be able to be making the point about why this is happening and what the eventual solution would look like.
Thanks, Ben. I'm going to keep going through points and questions from the floor because we've actually got a lot of them. And I think rather than try to bring the panelists back repeatedly in order to fit all these points in and questions, what I'll probably do is bring in everyone from the floor and then go back to the panelists. I know that's not terribly conversational of me, but I think otherwise what will happen is that we will only have a few things. So panelists, do take notes on what you're hearing and what you need to respond to. I've got a question myself, which I will shamelessly abuse the chair to ask nearer the time. But for now, over to John Palmer. So John, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I've greatly appreciated and learned from what all four of the contributors had to say. I think they really began to grapple with some of the complex but transforming issues that are at the heart of this whole post-COVID crisis that we're in. I just wanted to start by saying, as somebody who is so old, they can remember 1945 as a child, and what I do remember my adults talking about then was frequently people said, never again, and we're never going back to that again. It was a sort of ritual thing in most people's conversations. And I detect in the present climate, created both by the pandemic, of course, but also by the gross irresponsibility that governments, and in particular this British Tory government, has shown, that people are beginning to see that there is something more fundamentally wrong, A, with society, and B, with governance. So I think we need to sort of get a sense of that, that it isn't, we're not, as it were, crying in the wind, as so often the left are, when issues that we think are hugely important don't affect ordinary people. All the issues that have been discussed so far form part of the holistic strategy that we need. I don't want to let go of inequality, though. Inequality is the thing that the system finds most difficult to defend. It finds it most embarrassing, and in the extremes of the present crisis, where people in the inner cities, in the poorest areas, are more or less being left to be ravaged by this crisis without any priority from the government. I think that inequality should, as it were, feed into every aspect of what we're doing. My last point, is this. I agreed with a great deal that Hilary said. We need both public governance at a national level, indeed at a European and a global level, but we also need democratic transformation from the bottom. And sometimes it starts with small things. At present, for example, the demand that nobody should go back to work without the approval of trade union elected health and safety officers on the ground, separate to whatever the company says, that, it seems to me, is something that people will understand and will rally around. So I'm just saying that we need to think of all the empowerment demands that grow naturally out of this crisis. One of them is open the books, that the scientific advisors, we should demand open the books. What advice are you really giving? We've only got the government's version of what they're told, and there is growing evidence that politics has run, not science, the key decisions in the early phase of this crisis. I don't want to say any more. I just want to say all of these things need to feed into each other. They're not separate discourses, they're a part of the central discourse. And we should look at every point when we talk about democracy for very concrete demands like trade union, yes or no over return to work at every point to enliven the sense that people can have control.
I'm talking on mute again. It's a dreadful affliction. So thank you very much, John. That was all very interesting. And I'll now ask Richard Deutsch if you want to come in.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, indeed.
Okay. So first of all, I want to thank all the panelists. Really insightful. As you can probably tell from my accent that I come from a place where we don't have any public ownership, or not least in my lifetime, really. Which I thought one of the things that really struck out to me, I thought all the speakers really did a great job of talking about the need for and the challenges and the different forms of public ownership that we should be looking at. And also, John, I appreciated your comments. One of my questions is related to what's happened to the UK economy, and also Labour's push. I thought the manifesto was brilliant. So again, to John's point, and this goes to any of the panelists, why do you think that the UK veered back towards a market economy from all the benefits of the planned economy? That, I mean, when I speak to people and I hear about things, and even in the States, people who did live, in post-World War II experience with FDR, they elected FDR until he could no longer be reelected. So that gives you some indication. So I know a lot more about the history of the States. So I'm just curious to hear what the panelists think about why that shift and why it seems to be so difficult to get people to wake up to say, if this worked so well, why? And we see the effect now here. And then the other thing, this is really to Arielle. So you mentioned about that taxpayer research is now being taken over by private equity. So do you think that is because that there is no national money? There's no, we're not collecting the taxes, and we're not really, and we're also not benefiting by the research that's done. So instead of actually, owning the copyrights and also the benefits to society, we're selling those rights off, and then private companies are then just making all the profit on the research that we paid for it. So now private equity is getting into that and pushing the public ownership, which is going to push even all the fundamental research towards profit as opposed to personal benefit. So I think that was it. Thank you all very much. Michael, you're still off.
Thanks very much, Richard. I'll keep running through the speakers that we have from the floor. It's not too late if you still want to make a point or a question from the floor, but I would say we usually end these sessions at about 2:30 in the knowledge that they can run over towards 3. But we're keen. We know that Zoom isn't a great format for very long meetings. So do feel free to raise your hand, but do try to keep it as brief as possible from the floor now. Sorry to do that, but ideally under 2 minutes, if you can, or if it's a question, a really simple one, just ask it quickly. So over to Susie. Susie Roston.
Yeah, hello. Oh, hi. Yeah, I don't really know where to start, but I did write a bit on the chat just now. But in Cuba, they're actually getting a homeopathic remedy together, because in 2008 they had an outbreak of leptospirosis or something it's called, and they actually couldn't afford the vaccine. It was all too complicated, And so they ended up using a homeopathic remedy and or homeopathy basically as an intervention. They found it was really good and really worked. And now they have, and also the Indian government separately have got a homeopathic remedy that they're using as a sort of prophylactic treatment, just giving it to lots of people, because historically homeopathy, it was used in the cholera epidemic. It's about 30 years after homeopathy was discovered in 1850, around then, and also in the Spanish flu as well. And they got, you know, there are lots of historical documents showing how there are a lot less deaths, you know, far less deaths. Like, for instance, the homeopathic hospital got 2 deaths, I think, with the Spanish flu in just that area, whereas equivalent allopathic hospitals were getting like 169 deaths. So just that's just one thing to say about it. But in terms of actually right now, you know, we've got, like, I expect if I asked everyone out of these 100 people that are, you know, on this website, how many people have thought, right, I'll go and get vitamins because this is going on? How many people are looking after their diet, thinking I must get exercise, I must, you know, keep my immune system strong? When I say strong, I mean in balance, you know, so it works properly for you, not so it's too strong and it overreacts, and, you know. So what I'm trying to say is, I feel there's a bit of a hypocrisy going on all the time in left-wing groups over this, because, for instance, the thing that's come out is a lot about vitamin D recently, and you know, people with darker skin find it harder to make vitamin D. So 2 years ago, the chief medical officer at Sally Davis actually said all people with dark skin should actually take supplements all their life because they find it harder to process. Older people have much less vitamin D than younger people, you know. So I'm just saying, if you look at the disease, you know, you can see it's obviously a disease of poverty, but what does that mean? That means people aren't getting the correct nutrition, they're not doing the right things to sustain themselves, you know. So what I would suggest, because I've been very ill in the past, and I did this, and this is what worked, is that, you know, doctors can give blood tests. Yeah, can I just say one thing? Doctors can give blood tests for sort of minerals and vitamins, and that's one way people could protect themselves. They have a blood test, they find out if they're deficient, and then the doctor can help them with nutritional things or supplements or whatever's, you know, if they're not eating properly. And that's something we can do to protect ourselves now, because at the moment we're putting ourselves in the hands of the drug companies all the time. And left-wing people don't seem to question that at all. You know, they're looking at, you know, the drug companies have a vested interest in making us think.
You have to move on now.
Yeah, sorry.
Thanks. Okay, I don't want to endorse everything that was said there, but I will allow the panelists, including the person who talks a lot about taking on the drug companies, come back to that at the end. Not everything that is said in another Europe session goes with the endorsement of the organisation. Let me put it that way. Caroline from Tayson, you are next if you want to come up and speak.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
We can indeed.
Great, thanks. Well, first of all, thanks a lot for a great event. That's been very inspiring. And I've been really interested recently in participatory forms of democracy, like, for example, citizen assemblies or other kinds of ways of actually getting the public involved in political decision making. And I was wondering if the panel also thinks that is an idea that is actually feasible, or whether that is something that would practically take up far too long and thus wouldn't be a very pragmatic solution. So I'd be interested to hear your ideas about that. Thank you very much.
A lovely, lovely brief contribution there. Thanks very much, Caroline. I'm going to hand over to Sasha Ismail just now. Take it away, Sasha. We can hear you now, Sasha.
Hi, you can hear me okay?
We can indeed.
Okay, great. I just want to say two things. One is to emphasise what Ben said about public ownership of finance and the banks. I think that demand is incredibly relevant now in terms of the debate about reconstructing the economy coming out of the crisis, and also in terms of the debate about the climate crisis and how you would get the resources and leverage to actually tackle that. It was actually passed at TUC conference in 2012 and last year after being proposed by the Fire Brigade Union, but it's a kind of extreme example of the phenomenon where something gets passed and everyone ignores it. I think the FPU did the right thing to raise it, and I think on the left we need to find ways to push that demand forward. On a kind of more immediate level, I wanted to say the thing Hilary raised about public ownership of care is incredibly important. And when Nadia Whittam was sacked from the MP from Nottingham was sacked from her job as a care worker, I thought it was very, very good that rather than, she wrote in The Guardian, and rather than just saying, you know, look, this is bad, she used it to call for public ownership of the care sector. So I guess my question would be, how do we take those two campaigns at sort of different ends of the spectrum, public ownership of care, public ownership of the banks, how do we take those two things forward?
Thanks very much, Sasha. I'm going to abuse the chair. I won't stick my question in right at the end because that's too unfair. But I suppose my question to the panelists would be, how are we going to get towards any of this? We've spoken a lot about what kind of democratic ownership and what kinds of processes we need to go through sort of within the economy, differentiating between lots of different kinds of ownership and governance of various things, from transport to pharmaceuticals to the banks to all the rest of it. But what is our strategy? What strategy would you propose, or what strategy is open to the left towards moving towards really any of those outcomes, given that we have a Conservative government with a majority of 80, given that local government, the power of local government is massively curtailed compared to where it was, say, in the 1980s, given that the workers' movement is at a very low ebb? What's our method of going about getting towards these things in terms of practical politics? But don't answer that just yet. First of all, we've got 3 more speakers, and I'm going to close the list. So it'll go Luke, then Martin, then Chris. Luke, take it away.
Oh, hi everyone. Well, I was just actually going to firstly agree with what John Palmer said, is that we can't give up the fight against inequality, especially when we have 26 billionaires globally that control as much wealth as the bottom half of humanity. I think challenging that is extraordinarily important in this century, and mobilizing democracies to challenge that concentration of wealth and power that comes with it. We have these, financial entities, individuals, which have more power than many states globally, and that raises huge questions for how our democracy functions. Secondly, I was going to ask a question to the panel to talk about the role of cooperatives. It seems to me they can play a really important role in the new economy, especially in sectors where the price of entry is very low cost, and this was in the last Labour manifesto, these kinds of ideas, but I think they are really important. So if you have public finance backing cooperatives, you can get really good social outcomes with quite small amounts of money. And the same is true in terms of the knowledge economy as well. So where if you have free flow of information, then cooperative, and you break the power of the patents and so on, then then the price of entry comes down, and cooperatives could play a really powerful role in scientific innovation.
That was nice and concise. Martin Willey, go ahead. Martin,
can you hear me now, please?
We can indeed.
The one thing that I've learned from the recent and current crisis, which concerns me greatly, is our inability to respond in situations where the nation's under stress. Whatever mistakes the government's made, I think they genuinely wanted testing to get off the ground quickly. They wanted to source PPE effectively, and now they want to effectively recruit contact tracers. I don't think they wanted to abandon the elderly either. So what concerns me is that in designing an economy and a national structure going forward, we make sure that we are resilient. And I think privatisation of the care homes has obviously been a weakness in our current system. I think possibly the fragmentation into hospital trusts has also weakened our ability to respond. And I'm concerned that in both on the right, seeking privatisation and fragmentation in that way, and on the left in seeking local democracy, both of those could in their own way make us less resilient. I do think that whatever we'd like to see ideally in the future, we must make sure that it includes a resilience and an ability to respond effectively, because I think we've come up short.
Thanks very much. I'll go to Chris Ford now. Chris, go ahead.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you. So I think it was really welcome, the contributions and the agenda. I was particularly interested in what Janine had to say in terms of this question of state ownership. I think that we should try and learn lessons from the past and not forget the past. And this issue of the state and workers' participation, workers' ownership has been a recurrent debate which just seems to be so forgotten in the movement for many, many years. Now, last year, the Labour Party did a National Policy Forum consultation on public ownership, which tried to pose a lot of these questions on workers' self-management, on workers' control, on forms of social ownership. And it seems to be something the left doesn't want to talk about a lot. And I think we need to find a way that we can develop this, because we're not going to get socialism unless we actually address these questions. And I don't believe state ownership has taken us one iota towards socialism. If it did, I don't know what happened between 1945 and 1983, because we didn't get anywhere near it. And I think this is important today, because it was after the Great Depression and the 1929 crash, we had this big surge towards statism and state intervention in capitalism. And there's a strong tendency to that now, and there's a tendency to identify this with socialism. And I think we really need to resist this very strongly by posing another alternative to state ownership, which is social self-management, in my view. And that does relate a bit to the point Luke made. It's not just about changing forms of ownership. We need to change the nature of the economy. And the question of cooperatives, I think, sits very well with that. So there's some things I would like to pose that I think we should stop talking about. One of them, if the panel would agree, I think we should stop talking about neoliberalism. Neoliberalism isn't a system. Capitalism is a system, and it's the problem. And we need to talk about being anti-capitalist again. That seems to have been forgotten. I think we need to start talking again about workers' control and workers' self-management. That's been forgotten, certainly since the 70s, because Ken Coates once said to me, we can start talking about workers' control again when we start talking about public ownership again. Now, we're talking about public ownership again. I think we could start talking about workers' control again, but I think we shouldn't talk of public ownership, social ownership. State and society are not the same thing. And I think there's also a myth that we need to talk about, and that is state has never gone away. In the 1990s, there was a big tendency, when people spoke about globalization, about the retreat of the state. Global capital was overtaking state. That never happened. The state never retreated, and it's completely enmeshed in the economy, in private capital. It never retreated under the Thatcherites either. And we'll see that more and more, I think, as this crisis unfolds. But if it is a situation, hypothetically, that we saw lots of nationalisation by Johnson, lots and lots of state intervention, would we welcome that? Would that be a step towards socialism? Do we have a different agenda? And I think that's where we need to start looking at the alternatives.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Christopher, and thanks to everybody who's contributed from the floor. We're going to move back into the panelists just in a second, but thanks everyone for joining. These sessions are going to be happening every week at 1 p.m. Next week's session will probably be on the Brexit negotiations, the transition period, and whether or not we need to fight to extend it, and what is at stake in these negotiations. So do keep coming to these sessions. I'll be doing some shout outs for events and things specifically to do with public ownership. There's a couple of very interesting events that have been flagged to me. So I'll give you details of those in the chat and also later. I'll come back to the panelists now, and if panelists could kind of keep it brief. I mean, I would say 5 minutes, but that just seems ridiculous after the number of questions you've heard and the number of points you've heard, but certainly a shorter contribution than your first if we're going to get out of here within reasonable time. So try to aim for 5 minutes. Don't feel obliged to respond to absolutely everything. And I'll go in, I'm inclined to go in the same order that you spoke before, because we haven't heard from Albena for a long time. So Albena, take it away.
Okay, on the question about inequality, Luke Cooper, John Palmer and others raised, what is worrying is that when we talk about inequality, we keep talking about very different things. The political privileges of the rich, that's one thing. The poverty of the poor, so poor suffer because they do not have enough, not because others have more. That's why it's a different issue. So we need to ask, how are all these obscene masses of wealth accumulated? It is usually through the extraction of rent. If a company like Jeff Bezos is extracting rent, this kind of business should be put in public hands, because it is not open to any true competition. So I'm only appealing that we should call things by their real names in order to fight the right fight. Then let me move to the issue of what can we do next. Now, even if we would establish cooperatives, but these cooperatives are ownership owned by the workers with true public consultations, if these wonderful things are set up and led to operate in conditions of global economic competition, they will behave as public actors driven by the pursuit of profit. So what we should start from is to push for a different type of globalization that takes care of very high labor and environmental standards. And now is the time to push for that. Even the European, well, not left states, but Macron recently issued, the French government put a conditionality for the bailout of Air France not to compete with railways. So even, things are starting to unblock. The European competition commissioner suggested that states should take ownership of companies in order to prevent them from being bought out by China. But this is the moment to push for a different kind of European integration, different kind of, well, Britain cannot anymore, unfortunately, a different kind of globalization, starting with reducing the competitive pressures to which our countries are exposed. This is from me.
Excellent, and thanks for all your contributions today. They've been great. Janine.
Oh, there's some stuff to rattle through. Okay, London transport is better than transport elsewhere. Yeah, absolutely it is. My eldest son, Alex, who turns 21 today, he moved from London to Salford nearly 2 years ago, and he still can't get over how rubbish the transport is compared to how we have it in London. However, the danger is that it won't be that good for much longer, as we're expecting a massive attack on London transport, fares up, services down, attacks on workers' rights, etc., to make workers and passengers pay for the cost of the coronavirus crisis. And I think it's very important that, as one of the questioners answered, that open the books is part of our response to that. I'd love to have a look through Transport for London's books to count all the money that's been siphoned off by private companies, the fat cat salaries of senior managers. I think we should argue for a maximum wage as well as a higher minimum wage, and to look at things like taxing employers or taxing land to fund public transport, as is done in other countries. There was also a very good question about no going back, and I think that's really important. Okay, when we got the coronavirus pandemic and suddenly we can pay statutory sick pay from day one. Okay, we're not going to go, we shouldn't accept going back to only being paid from day 4. Suddenly we were able to house the homeless. Okay, suddenly we were able to stop benefit sanctions. All that kind of stuff we should not roll back, not allow the government to roll back at all. Should not, with the government that's taking control of the private hospitals, it shouldn't give them back. It should keep control of them. But I would kind of note in the margins, if you like, that there are some ways in which we do want to go back. The Coronavirus Act included some very serious attacks on civil liberties. For example, it reduced the rights of children with special educational needs and disabilities to an education. It allows the state now to section someone in mental distress on the say-so of 1 doctor rather than 2. That kind of thing we do want to go back on. So I'm thinking, no, go back, that's a good slogan. Perhaps a better tweak slogan might be, don't go back, go forward. And yes, we do need to take the attitude they took after World Wars and said, we're not going back to the crap we had before. There's also a point about health and safety reps and workers' empowerment. That is very, very important. Where I work on the underground, where we've got social distancing measures put in stations, it's been us that's done that. It's been workers that have made that happen. We haven't waited for the management to do it. And on this theme, it is very, very important that workers know and use their right to refuse to work on the grounds of health and safety concerns. If you have a reasonable fear that you or others are in serious or imminent danger, then you can refuse to do that work. There's a question about participatory democracy. I'm very much in favour of more participatory forms of democracy. I'm not convinced about citizen assemblies, which, as I understand it, the strict definition of them is that the people who attend are picked randomly. I think we should elect our representatives rather than pull them out of a hat. I agree with Sasha about public ownership of high finance in the care sector. I'm not convinced by the question about resilience, that the government wants to source PPP effectively. Seems to me what they want is people to go back to work. But the point was anyway that the government was starting from a point where it had no stocks of PPE and no public ownership or control over the production of it, which is why we're even talking about sourcing PPE rather than simply producing and distributing it. End on Michael's question about strategy. Yes, the labour movement is in a bad way, but we can't go around the labour movement, or we can't just abandon it or look to other agents of change. It remains the case that under a capitalist society in which a tiny ruling class owns the means of production and the rest of us, the working class, have to sell our labour to them, that it is that working class which is the force with the power to change society and make a new society. So we have to make our labour movement fit to fight. We have to clarify what we mean by socialism, and today's discussions be very useful on that. We have to support workers' struggles, workers' right and power to struggle, for instance, by repealing the anti-union laws, and make our movement accountable to its rank and file members. We don't just need workers' control of the economy, we need workers' control of our own movement.
Chance to be a fine thing. Thanks very much, Janine, for everything you've said today. And I'll now hand over to Arielle.
Okay, great. So I'm going to come back to Ben first about publicly owned pharma companies not being able really to compete because they're still in a marketplace economy, and also some points on patent law and IP that were coming up in the chat. I think all of this kind of really points to the fact that previously, perhaps in previous generations, we could take this on a nation by nation basis and deal with pharma companies in a nation. But now we really need to tackle, in the same way that we need to tackle the financial system on a global scale, because to prevent things running away and hiding in offshore tax havens, etc. We need to tackle things like public health and pharmaceutical companies in particular on a global scale, because that's where you get the necessary reform of patent law and tackle these companies that do have research and manufacturing bases across the world. So it needs to be a global response to that. On scientific innovation and somebody talking about publishing the science, interestingly enough, Luke, there are a lot of people in science who are doing really great things actually in terms of quite democratic, quite cooperative structures. They just don't call it that because they're scientists and they don't necessarily expect to think of it that way. But there are a lot of scientific communities out there that are working on making science open, properly providing the infrastructure for that, providing the forums for that. And I think in the future, what we'll see is, and what I'd like to see, is sort of state support for these kinds of cooperatives to be set up across the globe in response to working on particular problems, so that it's the scientists themselves that are involved in these working on these problems that are making the decisions about how the projects go and what they want to work on, and that's decided collectively. And there is already those kinds of communities out there that are working in that way, that are working towards an open structure, but we don't see them because they don't tend to talk about it in that way in these kinds of forums. So that's quite interesting. What else? In terms of resilience in future plans, I agree, and it would be really great if the country could do something like a pandemic preparedness exercise, say in 2016, and then actually act on the recommendations of that instead of ignoring it. There is an entire other webinar, I think, on how the government has handled its initial response to the coronavirus crisis. I don't think capitalism has helped, but there were certainly some things they could have done in that particular place. What else? On Sasha's point on public ownership of banks and care, I think, there are a lot of structures that actually should never be thought of as profit making, and one of them is finance, and another one is care, and another is the general public health. And we've become used to, as a society, thinking of them as though they must function like a business in order to be run well. And I'm definitely in favour of exploring alternatives to that kind of assumption that everything must be run as a business. But what I would caution is that this idea that we can innovate our way out of things, and taking a very tech company based approach to how we tackle stuff is becoming more prevalent, and that actually might be a bigger fight for us in terms of like the collective conscious of people who we need to win over, because people kind of now assume that becoming the next Facebook is the way that we solve things, and as we're about to discover with the NHS contact tracing app, that's probably not the case. How do we get towards this? How do we get towards utopia? I mean, I am taking a very top level perspective on this, but I think in a very sort of global perspective, because I think one of the key levels we do need to look at is globally. I think we need to be making links with struggles and organizations in other countries, and lobbying on an international scale for proper reform of international bodies, so that they are set up, equipped, and managed in a way that means that they can actually respond to crises like this that we're going to see in the future. A last point, if homeopathy worked, it would be called medicine, and I just want to make that point extremely clear. But I also do think that the COVID-19 crisis is showing us a lot about capitalism, its failings, and I am hopeful that it might demonstrate to some people that perhaps this is not the best way to run the economy, not the best way to run our lives, and that they actually can start to think of something as an alternative, and that the way things are at the moment can't stand and does have to change, and now in a way that the creeping crisis of climate change perhaps has not had that sense of urgency. So hopefully there will be a good force for change there.
Excellent. Covered a lot of bases like everyone else, and made some excellent points. Thanks for everything you've said today. And finally, to Hilary. Hilary, take it away.
Okay, so I'll try and be brief, but there's really good questions, really good. So there's a lot to say, but I'll cut it. So just maybe start with one or two issues raised about the present situation in this wider context. The point by Martin Willey about the government not wanting to give up testing, and it wasn't its will, as it were, it was its lack of capacity. I mean, I don't really agree with that way of putting it, because I think it's okay, not they didn't want to kind of do things that would increase the number of deaths, but their beliefs meant that they believed everything could be solved through a sort of laissez-faire, letting the market, letting the processes kind of see their way through, the sort of herd immunity idea. And they had contempt for the public sector. They've not got that. Their mentality is not one that believes in the public sector and in public institutions. So they didn't know, or they behaved as if they'd no knowledge of the possibilities of the public sector, of local government. For example, on this testing and tracing, you know, you have public health, public environment officers whose whole job is actually tracing. You know, that's their job. They've been trained at quite a high level to do that. And so, you know, that was a resource that was completely unused. Plus, as I said earlier, you know, all the mechanisms of integration and planning around PPE and so on, you know, they'd gone because of privatization, because privatization is driven by a kind of, you know, disregard for public benefit. So I think that that we've got to look at that fundamental difference between a real appreciation of the idea of a public good and public institutions driven by need and maximizing public benefit, as distinct from a profit maximizing system. Then issues that are raised by the crisis. I mean, Susie Roston's issue about homeopathy. I mean, I think that goes back to the issue of public health. I think that it's not so much homeopathy versus traditional medicine. It's recognizing that, you know, the whole issue of our immune systems related to the food we eat, the environment, the air, our relationship to nature, our well-being in lots of different ways, is crucial, and that isn't discussed enough. I mean, the vitamin D issue is discussed in a rather sort of I don't know, sort of crude way. I mean, it's not really just about supplements. I mean, actually, vitamin D is in your diet as well. And so there are a whole lot of measures that are not immediate. They don't fall into the NHS because they're not what can be done immediately. They're to do with the basic environment in which we live. And it's true that you could say capitalism is not healthy. It's not the kind of the highly industrialized agriculture, the polluting nature of industry, the kind of dangers of road transport. I mean, all these things, you know, make actually our environment very unhealthy, and that's where the issue of public health is fundamental. I mean, imagining a society in which public health was the driving force, ensuring that people were healthy and in a sustainable environment, would be fundamental. So I think that homeopathy should be part of the sort of public health agenda. So the other issues that are kind of also raised by this, the importance of what John Palmer's saying in terms of the different demands, empowerment demands. I mean, I think that actually you've seen, well, firstly on the information thing, the opening the books, I think that is really, really important and is the first step towards empowerment, because if you know, that gives you a kind of both a desire to act and a capacity to act. And I think that in the science debate, what's interesting is that people have begun to question the nature of the scientific advice, let alone the question of whether actually the whole thing is being led politically as distinct from scientifically, whatever they say. And so now you've got a really interesting development of this independent sage, a whole lot of scientists coming together to say, actually, and I think this relates to strategy, we don't just want to criticize, we want to illustrate what could be done. We want to sort of prefigure what a transparent approach to science would mean, and therefore a more effective, more publicly beneficial, because science develops through argument, through testing hypotheses, and that's what's been lacking, because there's no public debate, and that's what the SAGE group, the independent SAGE group rather, are trying to do. I think I agree about public ownership of the banks and of the care system, and I think that what we're seeing now, and this relates to strategy again, that we've got to build on the kind of new awareness, and I think there's now a massive awareness of you know, the failings of a private care system, and we've now got to really, really campaign on the whole idea of the care system being publicly owned and being part of the NHS. I think that's fundamental, and I'd like to see the unions taking that up. And I think that relates to the empowerment issue, that we are seeing that suddenly the unions, having been pretty kind of weakened by the, by austerity and anti-union legislation, the government and everybody is beginning to realise those workers are crucial. There's real attention, to the importance of obviously the health workers, but also delivery workers, transport workers. There's much more awareness of the kind of fundamental role of those workers, and I think that gives the unions potentially much more bargaining power. You can see it now with the teachers. They become the kind of a real national actor, defending the needs of their members and of parents and of children. And I think that we want to see the trade union movement making the most of that, but with people in the community. So probably my voice is giving out, so I think I better stop. Thanks.
No worries. Thanks, Hilary. Sorry your voice is giving up, but you got some really interesting thoughts out in the meantime. So 2 things left for me to do. One is to share with you 3 plugs which I have been told to share by audience members and indeed by Another Europe as Possible. Please do listen to them because they're quite handy. Firstly, the immigration bill is coming back to Parliament on Monday, and there are many attempts to try to oppose what is a pretty appalling piece of legislation that will expand the hostile environment to millions more migrants, including many of the people who are keeping the country running and saving lives at this time. And so the Labour Campaign for Free Movement, this is quite a Labour-y thing that has set this up, but it's a universal action, so it's still relevant to you even if you're not in the Labour Party, has set up a tool where you can write to your MP and ask them to vote against the bill with a single click. So I'm about to post that in the comments, and someone else just has. There's a meeting, a public meeting, secondly, on the 29th of May about the public ownership of the banks. That's not organised by Another Europe is Possible, but it's organised by some people involved in Another Europe is Possible. So that's the second link I will post, a meeting about public ownership of the banks on the 29th. And finally, on the 19th of May, somebody has asked me to raise a campaign for Uyghur solidarity. There is currently a pretty dreadful act of ethnic cleansing taking place in the hands of the Chinese state, and there's a protest going on against that. So there's a third link that we post in the chat there. So kill the bill. Secondly, public meeting about the banks, and thirdly, the Uyghur protest. They're all in the chat now. Do have a look at those links. But all that remains to do now is to thank all of the panelists for joining us in what has been a longer session than usual. But the reason why it's been longer is because turnout has been higher and the debate from the floor much more vigorous than usual on what is a big issue that will perhaps need more specific sessions to unpack. So thanks everyone for joining us. And as I say, next week's session, open to all Another Europe members, which is everyone here, is taking place at exactly the same time, 1 p.m. every Saturday, like every week. And it will be about what is at stake in the negotiations around Brexit, what's going on with the transition period, and should we all have a big panic. Thank you very much for joining us, everyone. And hopefully see you soon.
Bye all, thank you.